The waves crash against the shore, relentless and eternal. A man stands at the edge of the water, his cloak billowing in the salt-laden wind. A golden crown sits upon his head, glinting in the pale English sun. Behind him, a gathering of nobles and priests watch with bated breath as their king, a Viking king, commands the very ocean itself. The year is 1028. King Cnut the Great, ruler of England, Denmark and Norway, has ordered his throne to be placed at the edge of the rising tide. His courtiers whisper that the king believes himself divine, capable of controlling the very elements. The water inches closer, lapping at the wooden legs of his royal seat. Cnut raises his hand, his voice carrying over the crash of waves. "I command you, O sea, to retreat. Go back. Do not wet the feet of your sovereign lord." The tide continues to rise, indifferent to the command of even the most powerful man in northern Europe. Water soaks the king's boots, splashes against his robes. The courtiers shift uncomfortably, uncertain how their volatile ruler will react to this defiance of nature. But Cnut does not rage. Instead, he turns to his assembled court, his face grave with purpose. "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings," he declares, removing his crown. "For there is none worthy of the name but God, whom heaven, earth and sea obey." This is the moment history remembers, a lesson in humility from a king who had drenched 3 nations in blood to secure his throne. A Christian sermon from a man whose name once made monks tremble in terror. A philosophical statement from a ruler whose enemies were impaled on spears and whose rivals were systematically eliminated. But this story of piety masks a darker truth. How did one Viking become so feared, respected and powerful that even hardened warriors would lay down their weapons without a fight when they heard he was approaching? What kind of man could unite lands that had been at war for generations? And what terrible price did he, and those around him, pay for this power? This is the story of Cnut the Great, the Viking who transformed himself from a raider into a ruler, from a pagan warrior into a Christian king, from the son of a rebel into the emperor of the North Sea. It is a tale of betrayal, brutal ambition, and unexpected wisdom in an age where survival often meant being more ruthless than your enemies. The blood of legends flowed through his veins, yet the boy who would become England's most feared king entered the world as the son of an exile and a rebel. Born around 990 CE in Denmark, Cnut was the younger son of Sweyn Forkbeard, a fierce Viking warrior king who had seized the Danish throne from his own father, Harald Bluetooth. The family's history was steeped in violence even by Viking standards. Harald had forcibly converted Denmark to Christianity, building churches and erecting runestones proclaiming his faith. But his son Sweyn rejected this new religion, leading a rebellion that drove Harald from his kingdom, wounded and defeated. Legend claims Harald died of these wounds in Jomsvikings, far from the land he had ruled. This was the legacy Cnut inherited, a throne taken by force, a family divided by religion and ambition. More than that, he carried the blood of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, the semi-mythical Viking hero whose sons had once led the great heathen army that ravaged England a century earlier. The sagas claim that Ragnar was killed by being thrown into a pit of snakes by King Emma of Northumbria, and that his sons avenged him by carving the blood eagle on their father's killer, splitting open his ribs and pulling his lungs out through his back in a gruesome display of Viking vengeance. Whether these stories were true or merely propaganda to enhance the family's fearsome reputation, they served their purpose. The descendants of Ragnar were not to be trifled with. They were men who remembered slights for generations and collected debts in blood. Young Cnut grew up in this shadow, a prince of Denmark, but one who understood that power was never given, only taken. His father Sweyn, now firmly established as king, had embraced Christianity again for political convenience, but maintained the Viking traditions of raiding and conquest. From his earliest years, Cnut would have witnessed the dual nature of this new Viking kingship, Christian in name when it suited, pagan in practice when necessary. The boy's education likely began as it did for most noble Viking children, learning to handle weapons from age 5, studying the sagas, and understanding the complex web of alliances and blood feuds that define Norse politics. But Cnut's world was about to expand dramatically, due to events unfolding across the North Sea, in England. On November 13th, 1002, bells rang out across England, not in celebration, but as a signal for slaughter. What happened next would change the course of Cnut's life forever. King Ethelred II of England, later known as the Unready, more accurately translated as poorly advised, had grown weary of Viking raids on his shores. For years he had paid increasingly large sums of Danegeld, tribute money to buy peace from the Norse warriors, but the payments only seemed to encourage more raids. Frustrated and desperate, Ethelred ordered a mass killing of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records what followed. The king ordered all the Danish men who were among the English race to be slain, because the king had been informed that they would treacherously deprive him, and then all his counsellors, of life, and possess his kingdom afterward. Men, women and children were dragged from their homes and butchered. In Oxford, Danes sought sanctuary in St. Fridswide's church, but the English burned the church to the ground with them inside. Archaeological evidence has confirmed this horror. In 2008, excavations at Oxford revealed the remains of 35 to 40 young men who had been executed and buried in a mass grave dating to precisely this period. Among the dead was Gunhild, sister of King Sweyn Forkbeard, and aunt to young Cnut. She had come to England as a hostage to guarantee peace and had converted to Christianity. Her execution, along with her husband and son, transformed what might have been a local massacre into an international incident. When news reached Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard's rage was terrible to behold. What had been occasional raids now became a blood feud, a vendetta that would not end until he had Ethelred's crown. For young Cnut, perhaps 12 years old at the time, the message was clear. Christian kings could be just as treacherous as pagan ones, and mercy was a luxury his family could not afford. Sweyn began systematic attacks on England, no longer merely raiding but testing its defences, probing for weaknesses, and building toward a full invasion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records annual assaults from 1003 onward, with Sweyn personally leading many of them. These were not the hit-and-run tactics of traditional Vikings, but calculated military campaigns designed to break English resistance. While his father waged war across the sea, Cnut was sent to complete his education in the art of Viking warfare, and there was no better place for a young prince to learn the brutal realities of power than among the legendary Jomsvikings. The fortress of Jomsborg rose from the southern shore of the Baltic, like a wolf's teeth, white-painted wooden walls surrounding the most feared warrior brotherhood in the Viking world. Here, among killers and berserkers, the future King of England would learn the true meaning of terror. The Jomsvikings were an elite mercenary brotherhood who lived by a strict code. They accepted only the finest warriors between the ages of 18 and 50. No woman was allowed within their walls. No man could flee from an equal or lesser force. And most importantly, no Jomsviking could show fear, even in the face of certain death. While historians debate whether Jomsborg existed exactly as described in the sagas, there is little doubt that elite Viking warrior brotherhoods did exist, and that young nobles were often sent to train with experienced warriors. For Cnut, this education came under the tutelage of Thorkel the Tall, one of his father's most trusted commanders, and a renowned Jomsviking. Thorkel was a giant of a man, both in stature and reputation. The sagas describe him as a fearsome warrior who had survived countless battles. Under his harsh guidance, Cnut would have learned not just how to swing a sword, but how to lead men, how to inspire loyalty through both fear and respect, and most importantly, how to think strategically. Life in such a warrior brotherhood was brutal. Training began before dawn and continued until dusk. Young warriors fought with blunted weapons that still broke bones and drew blood. They learned to ignore pain, hunger, and exhaustion. They were taught to see death not as something to be feared, but but as an opportunity for glory, especially if they died with a weapon in hand, ensuring their place in Valhalla. For Cnut, there would have been no special treatment. A prince who could not fight would command no respect among Vikings. He would have slept on hard benches, like the others, eaten the same salt fish and coarse bread, and suffered the same punishments for failure. The sagas suggest he excelled in this environment, growing into a formidable warrior despite not having the towering physical presence of men like Thorkel. More importantly, Cnut learned the value of loyalty. The Jomsvikings were bound to each other by oaths stronger than family ties. They would avenge each other's deaths and fight to the last man, rather than break their word. This lesson would serve Cnut well in the years to come, though the bitter irony of his later betrayal by his mentor Thorkel would not be lost on him. By 1013, Cnut had become a man, perhaps 23 years old. He had proven himself in raids and skirmishes, if not yet in major battles, and now his father Sweyn Forkbeard was ready to make his final move against England, a full-scale invasion to claim the throne that he believed was rightfully his, both as vengeance for his sister's murder and as the descendant of Ragnar Lothbrok, whose sons had once ruled parts of the island. Sweyn summoned his son and Thorkel to join him in this greatest of ventures. The time had come for Cnut to put his training to the test in the crucible of war. The English coast disappeared beneath a forest of masts and dragon-headed prows. 300 longships carried 10,000 warriors, the largest Viking army seen since the great heathen army of Ragnar's sons. At its heart stood Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Cnut, who came to claim their blood price. The invasion force landed at Sandwich in Kent in the summer of 1013. Unlike previous raids, they did not immediately plunder and leave. This was a conquest, methodical and inexorable. They secured Northumbria first, where Danish settlers were numerous, and welcomed them as liberators rather than invaders. The 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester and Stamford, submitted without resistance. Sweyn and Cnut marched their army west, then south, a noose tightening around London, where King Ethelred had barricaded himself. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records, "Then all the nation regarded him, Sweyn, as full king. Town after town surrendered, preferring to pay tribute to the Danish king than face the alternative." For Cnut, this campaign was his true initiation into kingship. He watched as his father combined threats and diplomacy, violence and mercy in careful measure. Sweyn punished resistance harshly, but rewarded submission with protection. He respected church properties when it was politically expedient, and allowed them to be plundered when it served as an example. By Christmas 1013, even London had fallen. King Ethelred fled to Normandy with his wife Emma and their young sons, including the future Edward the Confessor. England belonged to the Danes. Sweyn Forkbeard had achieved what even Ragnar's sons could not: complete conquest of the wealthy island kingdom. For Cnut, it must have seemed like the beginning of a glorious new chapter. His father was now king of both Denmark and England, with Norway increasingly under Danish influence as well. As the second son, Cnut had not expected to inherit Denmark. That would go to his older brother Harold, but perhaps England would be his. But the gods, whether Christian or pagan, have always had a taste for irony. On February 3rd, 1014, just 5 weeks after his greatest triumph, Sweyn Forkbeard fell from his horse in Gainsborough and died suddenly. The empire he had built teetered on the brink of collapse, and his 20-something son found himself fighting for survival. The English lords who had so recently sworn allegiance to Sweyn immediately invited Ethelred to return, promising to support him if he would govern them more justly than before. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that Ethelred sent his son Edward with messengers declaring he would be a gracious lord to them and reform all the things which they hated. Cnut, barely established in his newfound power, suddenly faced a nation in revolt. The Danish fleet elected him king, but the English had already turned against him. With his father's experienced commanders, including Thorkel the Tall, he attempted to hold what had been won, but momentum had shifted. Ethelred returned with a vengeance, driving Cnut's forces back to their ships at Sandwich. Before fleeing, Cnut ordered the hostages his father had taken to be mutilated, their hands, ears and noses cut off before being put ashore. It was an act of frustrated cruelty that showed both his ruthlessness and his desperation. Forced to retreat to Denmark, Cnut faced another shock. His brother Harold, now king, was unwilling to share resources for another English campaign. The brothers reached an agreement. Harold would rule Denmark unchallenged, and Cnut would receive ships and men to reclaim England. But the humiliation of begging his brother for help would not be forgotten. For a year, Cnut prepared, gathering ships, men and supplies. He recruited mercenaries from across Scandinavia, promising them English land and treasure. Most importantly, he secured the support of Eric of Hlathir, the earl who ruled Norway as a Danish vassal, adding Norwegian ships to his fleet. The defeat had taught Cnut valuable lessons. He had been unprepared for the swift reversal of fortune. He had trusted too easily in oaths sworn to his father, and he had underestimated the determination of a king fighting for his ancestral throne. He would not make these mistakes again. In 1015, Cnut was ready. His fleet of 200 ships, carrying perhaps 10,000 warriors, set sail for England once more. But this time he was not his father's lieutenant. He was a king in his own right, fighting for a crown he now considered rightfully his, and he would show no mercy to those who had betrayed him. The dragon ships returned to England's shores in September 1015, their sails black against the autumn sky. But this was not the same Cnut who had fled in humiliation a year before. This Cnut had the cold eyes of a man who had learned that power comes only to those willing to seize it with bloody hands. Cnut's fleet landed at Sandwich in Kent, but quickly moved to Wessex, ravaging Dorset, Wiltshire and Somerset. This was not random destruction, but calculated terror. A message to the English that resistance would be costly. King Ethelred, now in his late 40s and chronically ill, could barely mount a response. The defence of the kingdom fell increasingly to his son, Edmund Ironside, a warrior prince who matched Cnut in both age and determination. As Cnut's army marched through England, a surprising figure joined him, Edric Striona, ealdorman of Mercia, and one of the most powerful nobles in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls him traitor of all traitors, noting that he brought 40 ships to Cnut's cause. This defection split England in two, with the North and Midlands increasingly under Danish control. The war took on a pattern of thrust and counter-thrust, with Cnut securing the north, while Edmund rallied resistance in the south. When King Ethelred died on April the 23rd, 1016, the English nobles in London immediately proclaimed Edmund king, while those in Southampton declared for Cnut. England now had two kings, neither willing to compromise. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Assandun, now Ashington in Essex, on October 18th, 1016. Edmund's army met Cnut's forces on a hillside in a battle that would determine England's future. The armies were evenly matched until Edric Striona, who had pretended to rejoin Edmund's side, fled the battlefield at a crucial moment, throwing the English into confusion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes what followed. Then did Edric, as he had often done before. He first began the flight with the Magansate people of Herefordshire, and so betrayed his royal lord and all the people of England. The slaughter was immense, with Cnut's forces killing many English nobles, bishops and abbots who had come to fight for their native king. Edmund escaped the battlefield, but was now too weakened to continue the struggle. The two kings met on an island in the Severn River called Alney, where they negotiated a peace treaty. England would be divided, with Edmund keeping Wessex and Cnut taking everything north of the Thames. Moreover, whichever king survived the other would inherit the entire kingdom. It was an agreement that seemed to give Edmund a chance to rebuild his strength. But within weeks, on November 30th, 1016, Edmund Ironside was dead in mysterious circumstances. Some chronicles suggest natural causes, others imply assassination. The timing was certainly convenient for Cnut, who now claimed the entire kingdom as they had agreed. At the age of just 26, Cnut had achieved what his father had only briefly managed. He was King of England. But holding a conquered kingdom would require more than military might. It would demand a transformation from Viking warlord to English monarch. And for that, Cnut would need to be both more brutal and more conciliatory than anyone expected. London, Christmas Day, 1016. The great cathedral of St. Paul's fell silent as a Viking warrior strode toward the altar. Archbishop Wulfstan, his hands trembling slightly, raised the ancient crown of Alfred the Great. The congregation watched in stunned silence as their conqueror knelt to receive the blessing of the Christian God he had once rejected. Cnut's coronation was a carefully orchestrated political statement. By accepting the crown from the English archbishop, rather than simply declaring himself king by right of conquest, he signalled his intention to rule as a legitimate English monarch, not merely as a foreign occupier. He swore to uphold English law and protect the church, promises that must have rung hollow to those who had witnessed the brutality of his conquest. Indeed, Cnut's first actions as king were ruthlessly pragmatic. He had to secure his throne against any potential challengers, particularly the surviving members of the old royal house. Edmund Ironside had left 2 infant sons, Edward and Edmund. Rather than have them killed outright, which would have outraged the English, Cnut sent them into exile in Hungary, far beyond his reach, but also far from any English supporters. Ethelred's older sons from his first marriage posed a more immediate threat. The chronicles are suspiciously silent on their fate, but they disappear from the historical record shortly after Cnut's coronation. The sons from Ethelred's second marriage to Emma of Normandy, Alfred and Edward, the future confessor, remained safely in Normandy under the protection of their uncle, Duke Richard. Next, Cnut turned his attention to the English nobility who had opposed him. At his first royal council in 1017, he had several prominent ealdormen executed without trial. Most notable was Eadric Streona, the very man whose betrayal had helped Cnut win at Assandun. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, Cnut told Earl Eric of Northumbria, "Make this man higher than other men," after which Eric cut off Eadric's head with his battle-axe. When questioned about this betrayal of a man who had served him, Cnut reportedly replied, "He who is false to his own lord is likely to be false to me also." It was a chilling message to the surviving English nobles. Loyalty would be rewarded, but treachery, even in the king's service, would not be tolerated. Having eliminated his enemies, Cnut moved to consolidate his position through a strategic marriage. In July 1017, he wed Emma of Normandy, the widow of King Ethelred and mother of the exiled princes. It was a shocking move that served multiple purposes. It neutralised the threat of Norman support for Emma's sons, gave Cnut a connection to the previous dynasty, and provided him with a queen who already knew how to navigate English court politics. For Emma, it was a pragmatic choice to protect her position and potentially her sons' futures. For Cnut, it came with a complication. He already had a handfast wife, or concubine in the Norse tradition, Elfgifu of Northampton, who had borne him 2 sons, Sweyn and Harold Harefoot. This created a potential succession problem that would eventually tear apart everything Cnut built. With his position in England secured through blood and marriage, Cnut began the remarkable transformation that would define his reign. The Viking conqueror began to reinvent himself as a Christian Anglo-Saxon king. The transformation was as calculated as it was complete. The blood-soaked Viking warrior who had mutilated hostages now presented himself as a pious Christian king, a patron of churches and a maker of just laws. Yet beneath this new facade, Cnut's ambition burned as fiercely as ever, now fixed on building an empire his father could only have dreamed of. Cnut divided England into 4 great earldoms: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia and Wessex, appointing trusted lieutenants to govern them. Notably, 3 of these earls were Scandinavians: Thorkill the Tall, Eric of Hlathir, and his brother-in-law Ulf. Only Godwin an ambitious Englishman who had joined Cnut's side early, received Wessex. This arrangement allowed Cnut to reward his supporters while maintaining control through a balance of Danish and English interests. To win the support of the church, Cnut became a lavish patron, donating gold and silver to major abbeys and commissioning religious artwork. He made a particular show of honouring Saint Edmund, an English king killed by Vikings in 869, by building a stone church at Bury Saint. Edmund. The irony of a Danish king honouring a saint his own people had martyred was surely not lost on the English, but it demonstrated Cnut's political astuteness. In 1018, having extracted an enormous tribute of £82,500 from the English, nearly £300,000 of silver, Cnut paid off most of his Viking army and sent them home, keeping only 40 ships worth of warriors as his personal guard, known as the housecarls. This professional force, loyal only to him, became the backbone of his military power, while relieving the English of the burden of supporting a large occupying army. The same year, at Oxford, Cnut issued a proclamation declaring that he would rule according to the laws of King Edgar, an English king remembered for his just governance. "I will be a gracious lord and a faithful observer of God's rights and just secular law," he declared. It was a shrewd move to position himself as a continuator of English traditions rather than a foreign usurper. For 6 years, Cnut focused on establishing his rule in England, rarely leaving the country. He issued law codes that protected the church, reinforced existing English customs, and imposed heavy penalties for violating the king's peace. The country, exhausted by years of Viking raids and civil war, gradually accepted his rule as preferable to continued conflict. But Cnut had not forgotten his Scandinavian heritage or ambitions. In 1019, news arrived that would once again change the course of his life. His brother Harold, King of Denmark, had died without an heir. Denmark beckoned like a birthright too long denied. Without hesitation, Cnut gathered his fleet and sailed for the land of his fathers, determined that no one would deny him this second crown. Behind him, he left a pregnant queen and a kingdom still adjusting to its Viking ruler. Cnut's claim to the Danish throne was strong, but not unchallenged. His nephew Håkon, son of his sister and Eric of Hlathir, had been ruling as regent in Harold's absence and might have harboured royal ambitions. More dangerously, Olaf Haraldsson, known later as St. Olaf, had established himself as King of Norway after the collapse of Danish influence there following Sweyn Forkbeard's death. Arriving in Denmark with his English-financed fleet, Cnut moved quickly to secure recognition from the Danish Thing assembly. His wealth, reputation, and military strength made resistance futile. By 1020, he was firmly established as King of Denmark as well as England. Rather than remaining in Denmark, however, Cnut appointed his brother-in-law Ulf as regent and returned to England, where his wife Emma had given birth to a son, Harthacnut. This boy, born to his Christian wife rather than his Norse concubine, was clearly being positioned as his heir, at least for England. For the next 6 years, Cnut ruled his dual kingdom, travelling between England and Denmark, and gradually extending his influence. In England, he continued his policy of balancing Danish and English interests while promoting himself as a Christian king. In Denmark, he strengthened royal authority and built new churches, bringing the English model of church-crown cooperation to Scandinavia. But to the north, Olaf of Norway remained a threat and a rebuke to Cnut's ambitions. The Norwegian king had raided Danish territories and was building his own reputation as a Christian monarch. For Cnut, whose grandfather had ruled Norway, this was intolerable. Moreover, Norwegian Vikings continued to raid England's northern coasts, undermining Cnut's promise of protection. In 1026, Cnut decided to eliminate this final obstacle to his dominance of Scandinavia. He assembled a massive fleet. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims it was the largest seen since the beginning of the English nation, and sailed for Norway. At the Battle of the Helgeå River, Cnut's forces defeated a combined Swedish-Norwegian army, forcing Olaf to flee to Russia. By 1028, Norway too had submitted to Cnut. He was now ruler of an empire that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Baltic, encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Contemporary chroniclers called it the North Sea Empire, an unprecedented achievement that made Cnut the most powerful monarch in Northern Europe. At his court in Winchester, Cnut now styled himself King of all England and Denmark and the Norwegians and of some of the Swedes, a title that no Viking leader before him could have claimed. He was in effect an emperor, though he never used that specific title. It was at this moment of supreme achievement that Cnut allegedly performed his most famous act, the attempt to command the tide. While often misinterpreted as evidence of megalomania, the actual story as told by Henry of Huntingdon suggests something far more interesting about this complex king. The tide continued to rise, soaking the king's robes and threatening his throne. The courtiers held their breath, expecting rage from their volatile monarch. Instead, Cnut rose calmly, stepped back from the advancing water, and addressed them with words that would echo through the centuries. "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings," he declared, hanging his crown on a crucifix. "For there is none worthy of the name but God, whom heaven, earth, and sea obey." This demonstration, far from showing delusion, revealed Cnut's political genius. By staging this scene, he accomplished several things at once. He humbled himself before God, enhancing his Christian credentials. He demonstrated to his courtiers that he recognised the limits of earthly power, and he created a memorable piece of political theatre that would be recounted throughout his kingdoms. The tide episode, likely staged around 1028 at the peak of Cnut's power, reflected his understanding that ruling an empire required more than military might. It required moral authority, especially for a king whose initial claim to the throne had come through conquest rather than birth. This understanding was further demonstrated by Cnut's pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, a journey that served both religious and political purposes. In Rome, he attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, meeting rulers from across Europe and negotiating reduced tolls for English and Danish travellers on the roads to Rome. From Pope John XIX, he secured agreements favourable to English and Danish churches. A letter Cnut sent back to England after this visit reveals how thoroughly he had embraced his role as a Christian monarch. "I have vowed to God to lead a right life in all things, to rule justly and piously my realms and subjects, and to administer just judgment to all. If heretofore I have done anything beyond what was just, through headiness or negligence of youth, I am ready, with God's help, to amend it utterly." Whether this represented genuine religious conviction or political calculation is impossible to know. What is clear is that Cnut understood the value of Christianity as a unifying force for his diverse realms and as a source of legitimacy for his rule. But even as Cnut presented himself as a pious king, troubles were brewing within his empire. His brother-in-law Ulf, left as regent in Denmark, had grown too ambitious in the king's absence. According to the sagas, Ulf had gone so far as to proclaim Cnut's young son, Harthacnut, as king, effectively attempting to establish his own power as the boy's guardian. When Cnut returned to Denmark, he initially appeared to forgive this overreach. But after a chess game that ended in an argument, Cnut ordered Ulf killed, in a church no less. To atone for this sacrilege, Cnut donated extensive properties to the cathedral, once again using church patronage to cleanse the stain of violence. In Norway too, resistance was growing. Cnut had appointed his elder son by Elfgefu, Sweyn, as regent under his mother's guidance. But their harsh rule and heavy taxation sparked resentment. By 1030, the exiled King Olaf had returned to reclaim his throne. Cnut rushed forces to Norway, and at the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, Olaf was killed. But this victory would prove Pyrrhic. Olaf's death transformed him into a martyr and saint in the eyes of many Norwegians. Strange phenomena were reported at his tomb, and a cult quickly developed around him. Within 5 years of his death, Olaf would be canonised, and the religious fervour surrounding him would undermine Danish rule in Norway. These challenges revealed the fundamental weakness of Cnut's empire. It depended too heavily on his personal presence and authority. When he was in England, Denmark grew restless. When he was in Denmark, Norway chafed under his rule. And always there were those who remembered the old English dynasty and wondered if the sons of Ethelred might someday return. The greatest Viking king to ever live was dying, and he knew it. At 45, his body was failing him, the result of a life spent in battle, the rigours of constant travel between his kingdoms, and perhaps the heavy drinking common to Norse warriors. As 1035 drew to a close, Cnut made his final arrangements, but they would not survive him for long. Cnut's health had been declining for several years. Recognising the fragility of his empire, he had already made provisions for its future. His son by Emma, Cnut, was established as king in Denmark. His elder son by Elfgifu, Sweyn, had died in 1030, but their second son Harald Harefoot remained in England, gathering support among the northern earls who preferred a ruler of Norse blood. Cnut's preference appears to have been for Cnut to inherit both England and Denmark, creating a North Sea kingdom with its centre of gravity in Denmark. But Cnut was occupied with threats from Norway and could not immediately claim the English throne upon his father's death. On November 12, 1035, Cnut died at Shaftesbury in Dorset. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records simply, "In this year, King Cnut died. The man who had conquered England, united it with Denmark and Norway, and built the greatest Viking empire in history, passed with little ceremony into the pages of history. He was buried in the Old Minster at Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, alongside the English kings he had fought so hard to replace. It was a final symbolic joining of the Viking and Anglo-Saxon traditions that Cnut had worked to reconcile throughout his reign. But the empire he had built, through force of will and personality, began to unravel almost immediately. In England, a succession crisis erupted between Harald Harefoot and Cnut, with Emma championing her son's cause. Eventually, Harald seized power, forcing Emma to flee to Flanders. In Norway, Magnus the Good, son of the martyred Olaf, returned from exile to reclaim his father's throne with widespread popular support. The Danish regents were expelled, and Norway's brief inclusion in Cnut's empire came to an end. When Cnut finally prepared to invade England in 1040 to claim his inheritance, he learned that Harald had died. He ruled England for just 2 years before dying himself at a wedding feast, reportedly while drinking a toast. With no direct heirs from Cnut's line, the throne passed to Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred and Emma, restoring the Old English dynasty. By 1042, just 7 years after Cnut's death, his North Sea empire had completely collapsed. Denmark, England and Norway were once again separate kingdoms, and the dream of a united Scandinavian realm under a single crown would not be realised again until the Union of Kalmar in 1397, more than 350 years later. Yet Cnut's legacy extended far beyond his short-lived empire. In England, his reign marked the end of the Viking Age as a period of raiding and the beginning of a new era of Scandinavian influence through settlement and rule. The administrative structures he established, particularly the powerful earldoms, would shape English politics for generations. His legal codes, which blended Danish and English traditions, contributed to the development of English common law. In Denmark and Norway, Cnut's promotion of Christianity accelerated the conversion of Scandinavia. His patronage of churches and monasteries, his pilgrimage to Rome, and his self-presentation as a Christian king provided a model for later Scandinavian rulers seeking to integrate their realms into Christian Europe. Perhaps most significantly, Cnut represented a turning point in how Vikings saw themselves and were seen by others. No longer merely raiders from the north, they could be rulers of complex multi-ethnic states. The warrior ethos remained, but it was now channeled into state building rather than plundering. The boy who had watched his father rebel against his grandfather, who had been educated among the fearsome Jomsvikings, who had fled England in humiliation only to return in triumph, had transformed not just himself, but the very nature of Viking kingship. He had shown that the descendants of Ragnar Lothbrok could not only conquer, but govern, not only destroy, but build. And in doing so, he had earned his epithet, Cnut the Great, the Viking who became more than a Viking, the conqueror who became a king, the pagan warrior's son who became a Christian monarch, a man who understood that true power lay not just in inspiring fear, but in commanding respect. Fear, it is the thread that runs through Cnut's story, like blood through veins. The fear he inspired, the fear he manipulated, and perhaps, in quiet moments none witnessed, the fear he himself felt as he balanced atop an empire built on violence and oaths that could be broken as easily as they were made. Why did Vikings, men who supposedly welcomed death in battle as a path to Valhalla, fear Cnut more than the end of their lives? The answer lies not in simple brutality, though Cnut could be brutal when necessary. It lies in his understanding of power's true nature. The traditional Viking respected strength and courage above all. To die well was the ultimate goal, weapon in hand, facing one's enemy, securing a place in the afterlife among the chosen warriors. But Cnut offered something more terrifying than death: irrelevance, obsolescence, the knowledge that the world was changing, and those who could not change with it would be left behind, forgotten by history. Consider the Viking leaders who opposed him. They did not simply lose battles, they lost their place in the world. Olaf Haraldsson of Norway died and became a saint, his pagan Viking heritage washed away by Christian veneration. Those who surrendered to Cnut were absorbed into his new order, given lands and titles, but required to adapt to a world where Christianity, literacy, and administrative skill mattered as much as prowess with an axe. Cnut represented the future, a future where Vikings would no longer be raiders, but rulers, no longer outsiders, but the establishment. For many, this transformation was more frightening than any battlefield death. It required abandoning centuries of tradition and identity. Those who could not make this transition faced a choice: submit to Cnut's new order or be eliminated, not just physically, but culturally. This was the true source of the fear Cnut inspired. He did not merely threaten men's lives, he threatened their understanding of what it meant to be Norse. And he did this not by rejecting Viking heritage, but by transforming it, showing that the descendants of Ragnar Lothbrok could build empires as well as they had once burned monasteries. The paradox of Cnut's reign is that while he presented himself as a Christian king, he wielded power in ways that would have been familiar to his pagan ancestors. He eliminated rivals ruthlessly. He used marriage as a political tool. He demanded absolute loyalty and punished betrayal with death. The methods of power had not changed, only its justification and objectives. What makes Cnut fascinating is not just what he achieved, but how he achieved it, through a remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The young warrior who mutilated hostages in 1014 became the pilgrim king who knelt before the Pope in 1027. The Viking who conquered England became the English king who sent his Viking army home. He understood that different situations required different personas, and he moved between them with a fluidity that bewildered contemporaries and continues to confound historians. Was he sincere in his Christianity? Did he truly believe he had a responsibility to rule justly? Or was it all calculation, a brilliant performance by a man who saw religion and law as tools of control? We cannot know his heart. What we do know is that he was effective, and in politics, effectiveness often matters more than sincerity. Cnut's legacy is complex and contradictory. He was the last great Viking conqueror and the first great Scandinavian statesman. He accelerated the Christianization of the North while using violence that Christianity condemned. He promoted English law while acquiring his throne through its violation. He built an empire that collapsed almost immediately after his death, yet established patterns of governance that would endure for centuries. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Cnut's reign was how it transformed the relationship between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. Before Cnut, Vikings were primarily seen as external threats, raiders who appeared from the sea to plunder and then vanish. After Cnut, Scandinavian rulers were recognised as legitimate members of the European political community, capable of participating in its religious, diplomatic and commercial systems. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it solely Cnut's work. But his reign marked a crucial turning point, the moment when the most successful Viking of his age chose to work within European systems rather than against them, to build rather than merely to take. For the people who lived under his rule, Cnut's empire brought a period of relative peace after decades of conflict. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally quick to criticise foreign rulers, acknowledges that he governed well. Danish sources remember him as a strong king who increased their nation's prestige. Even in Norway, where his rule was resented, he is recognised as a figure of historical importance. But empires built by exceptional individuals rarely survive them, and Cnut's was no exception. The structures he created were not strong enough to withstand the tensions inherent in ruling diverse peoples across the North Sea. Without his personal authority to hold it together, the empire fragmented along its natural fault lines. This too is part of his legacy, the lesson that fear alone cannot build lasting political structures. Institutions, shared interests and common identity are needed to sustain what force creates. Cnut understood this intellectually, as his legal and administrative reforms show, but he did not have time to complete the work of integration that might have preserved his creation. In the end, Cnut's story raises a question as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Is fear the only path to peace? Can order be maintained without the threat of violence that Cnut so effectively deployed? History since his time suggests that while fear can create temporary stability, lasting peace requires something more: shared values, mutual benefits and governance that people accept as legitimate, not merely inevitable. Cnut the Great, conqueror, king and empire builder, left us this question to ponder. His remarkable life showed both the power and the limitations of rule through fear. The Vikings feared him more than death, but fear alone could not preserve what his ambition created. Was Cnut the greatest Viking king who ever lived, or was he the most brutal politician of his time? Perhaps he was both, a man who understood that in the 11th century, greatness and brutality were often two sides of the same blood-stained coin. His story reveals something profound about power and leadership in turbulent times. When societies are in transition, as England and Scandinavia were during Cnut's lifetime, moving from pagan tribal structures toward Christian feudal monarchies, those who can navigate both worlds hold immense advantage. Cnut could speak to Vikings in terms of honour and battle glory, while addressing English nobles with references to law and Christian duty. He could pray in churches he had once allowed his men to plunder. He could execute rivals one day and issue legal protections the next. This chameleon-like ability made him effective, but was it admirable? Should we celebrate a ruler who achieved peace through calculated violence? Who used religion as a political tool? Who betrayed allies when convenient? These questions have no simple answers, but they are worth considering as we reflect on Cnut's legacy. What do you think? Was Cnut's transformation from Viking raider to Christian king genuine conversion or political theatre? Did his empire collapse because it was built on fear, or simply because no successor matched his political genius? Could his North Sea empire have survived with better planning or different circumstances? If you found this exploration of Cnut's life and legacy intriguing, there's much more to discover about the Viking Age and its complex relationship with the medieval Christian world. The story of how Norse raiders became European monarchs, how pagan warriors adopted the religion of those they once terrorised, is one of history's most fascinating transformations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other historical figures walked the line between two worlds as Cnut did? How do modern leaders use fear and legitimacy to maintain power? The conversation about what makes effective leadership and what makes it just is as relevant today as it was in Cnut's time. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most compelling figures, consider subscribing for more explorations of the past that help us understand our present. History's greatest lessons often come from its most complicated characters, and few were more complicated than Cnut the Great, the Viking king who commanded the tide.